Hello and welcome to Sleep Through History. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. Tonight, we journey to a city that should never have existed, built on marsh and ambition, where merchants became kings and wooden stakes held up an empire. This is Venice before the gondola rides and souvenir shops, before the selfie sticks and cruise ships. This is the Venice of salt monopolies and stolen saints, of crusader fleets and secret police. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. There is a city that floats, not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. A city built on water, held above the Adriatic Sea by millions of wooden stakes, driven deep into clay and sand, defying every principle of common sense and engineering logic. A city where streets are liquid and doorsteps kiss the tide. A city that has stood for more than 15 centuries, despite every rational calculation suggesting it should have sunk into the lagoon within a generation. This is Venice. And before it became a backdrop for tourists and gondola rides, it was something far stranger, far more powerful, and far more ruthless than any modern visitor could imagine. If you were to stand on the Rialto Bridge in the year 1400, you would not see souvenir vendors or gelato shops. You would see the beating heart of global commerce, a market where silk from China met silver from Germany, where spices from India were traded for furs from Russia, where information itself became currency, and knowledge of distant ports could make or break fortunes overnight. The city hummed with 100 languages, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon and salt, tar and incense, fish and fortune. But even more impossible than its wealth was its very existence. Venice was built on 118 small islands, separated by canals and linked by over 400 bridges. Beneath every palace, every church, every warehouse lies a forest of alder and oak and larch, trees cut from the mainland forests and driven vertically into the sediment. These wooden pilings, submerged in the oxygen-poor mud and seawater, petrified over time, becoming harder than stone. The entire city rests on this underwater forest, a civilization built on timber that never saw sunlight again after it was hammered into the earth. No other city in human history has been founded on such an improbable foundation. Not Rome, not Athens, not Babylon, only Venice. And the question that haunted medieval observers, the question that still haunts historians today, is breathtakingly simple. Why? Why would anyone choose to build a city here, in a malarial swamp where fresh water had to be collected in cisterns, where every brick and stone and piece of timber had to be imported by boat, where the ground itself shifted with the tides? The answer lies not in ambition, but in desperation, not in conquest, but in refuge. Venice was born from fear. In the 5th century, the Roman Empire was collapsing. Barbarian armies swept down from the north, Huns and Goths and Lombards, burning cities and slaughtering populations. The people of the Veneto region, the fertile plains of northeastern Italy, fled for their lives. Some went to the mountains, others went to the sea. They waded into the shallow lagoon, into the maze of marshes and mudflats that separated the mainland from the Adriatic. And there, on unstable islands of sediment and reed, they built shelters. They drove stakes into the mud. They laid planks across the stakes. They survived. What began as a temporary refuge became permanent. The barbarians never followed them into the lagoon. The swamps protected them better than any city wall. And slowly, generation by generation, those desperate refugees transformed their marshy hideaway into something unprecedented. They learned to read the tides, to navigate the labyrinth of channels, to harvest salt from the evaporation ponds. Salt became their first currency, their first power. In a world without refrigeration, salt meant preservation, and preservation meant survival. Venice controlled the salt. By the 9th century, the refugee settlement had become a maritime power. By the 11th century, it was a republic with its own fleet, its own laws, its own elected leader, called the Doge. By the 13th century, it was the wealthiest city in Europe, a commercial empire stretching from London to Constantinople, from Alexandria to the Black Sea, and all of it balanced on wooden stakes in a lagoon. The improbability of Venice is not just architectural, it is political, economic, and cultural. This was a city without natural resources, without fertile land, without fresh water or stone or timber. Everything had to be imported, everything had to be earned through trade and cunning and relentless maritime expansion. Venice produced nothing except ingenuity. Yet from this impossible foundation, the Venetians built an empire that lasted longer than Rome's western territories, that survived the fall of Byzantium, that outlasted the Crusades and the Black Death and the Ottoman sieges. They built a republic that endured for 11 centuries, longer than any democracy in human history before or since. The city itself became a work of art. Palaces lined the Grand Canal, their facades painted in ochre and vermilion, their windows reflecting the water in endless ripples of light. Churches rose with domes of gold and marble, their interiors glittering with Byzantine mosaics stolen from the east. Bridges arched over narrow canals where gondolas glided in silence, their black hulls cutting through green water. But beneath the beauty lay something darker, something stranger. Venice was a city built on contradictions, a republic governed by aristocrats, a Christian power that traded with Muslim sultans, a democracy that employed secret police, a merchant state that conquered empires. To understand Venice is to understand that human beings are capable of building the impossible. If the alternative is oblivion, the Venetians did not choose the lagoon because it was promising. They chose it because they had no choice. And from that desperate decision, they forged a civilization that would reshape the Mediterranean world and beyond. This is the story of that impossible city. Not the Venice of tourist brochures, but the Venice of salt merchants and crusader fleets, of spice monopolies and political intrigue, of doges and courtesans and secret councils. The Venice that rose from nothing and fell to nothing, leaving behind only stones and water and memory. The Venice that should never have existed, but did. In the beginning, there was only water and fear. The year was 402. The Roman Empire, which had ruled the known world for half a millennium, was dying. Not gradually, not peacefully, but violently, torn apart by barbarian armies that swept across the Alps like floodwaters breaching a dam. Cities that had stood for centuries burned in a single afternoon. Populations that had never known war suddenly learned the language of terror. The Visigoths came first, led by Alaric, sacking Rome itself in 410. Then came the Huns, under Attila, whose name alone emptied villages before his armies arrived. Then the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, wave after wave of warriors from the frozen north, hungry for the wealth and warmth of Italy. For the people living in the Veneto, the fertile plains stretching from the Alps to the Adriatic Sea, there was nowhere to run. The mountains were too far, the cities were already falling, and so they turned to the one place no invader would follow, the lagoon. It was not a promising refuge. The Venetian lagoon was a shallow, brackish expanse of water, separated from the open Adriatic by a thin barrier of sand. Islands called the Lido. At low tide, vast mudflats emerged, treacherous and sticky, impossible to cross on foot or horseback. At high tide, the water was too shallow for large vessels, but deep enough to swallow anyone unfamiliar with the shifting channels. It was a maze of marsh grass and mosquitoes, of stagnant pools and sudden storms. But it was safe. The barbarians were land warriors, horsemen and infantry, unfamiliar with boats and uninterested in pursuing terrified refugees into a malarial swamp. So the Veneti, as they were called, waded into the lagoon with whatever they could carry. They brought tools and seeds, livestock and children, relics and memories. They found small islands of compacted sediment, barely above water level, and there they built. The first structures were simple. Wattle and daub huts on wooden platforms, elevated above the tidal flats. They drove stakes into the mud, thick posts of alder and oak, and lashed planks across them to create foundations. They thatched roofs with marsh reeds. They dug wells into the clay, hoping to find pockets of fresh water trapped beneath the salt. Life was brutal. The summer heat bred disease. The winter cold seeped through every crack. Fresh water was scarce, food was scarcer. They fished the lagoon and hunted waterfowl. They gathered mussels and crabs from the mudflats. They learned to boil seawater in clay pots, evaporating it under the sun to harvest salt, the white gold that would eventually make them rich. But in those early years, there was no wealth, only survival. The islands had names that spoke of their humble origins. Rivo Alto, the high bank, which would later become the Rialto, Olivolo, named for the olive trees that somehow grew there, Spinalonga, the long thorn, Torcello, the little tower. These were not grand settlements but clusters of families, connected by narrow channels and shared desperation. The Veneti were not a unified people. They came from different towns, different backgrounds, different loyalties. Some had been merchants in Aquileia, the great Roman city to the north. Others had been farmers, fishermen, craftsmen. They spoke Latin and Greek and the local dialects of the Veneto. They worshipped at makeshift altars, praying to saints whose relics they had carried across the water. What united them was the lagoon itself. It shaped their lives, their language, their very identity. They learned to read the water the way farmers read the sky. They memorized the channels by heart, navigating in fog and darkness by instinct and landmarks invisible to outsiders. They understood that the lagoon was both protector and prison, that to leave meant vulnerability, but to stay meant isolation. And yet, slowly, they began to thrive. By the 6th century, the settlements had grown into villages. Small churches appeared, built on foundations of wooden pilings, driven deep into the clay. Boats replaced footpaths as the primary means of travel. Markets emerged where fishermen traded their catch for bread and wine brought from the mainland. The refugees were becoming something else. They were becoming Venetians. The transformation was not accidental. The lagoon demanded adaptation. It required a people who could think in terms of water rather than land, who could build vertically on unstable ground, who could trade rather than farm, who could navigate rather than march. The environment itself filtered out anyone unwilling or unable to embrace this aquatic existence. By the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire, which still controlled much of Italy, recognized the growing importance of these lagoon settlements. Byzantine governors arrived, bringing a taste of imperial administration and Eastern influence. The Veneti adopted Byzantine styles in architecture and art, Byzantine bureaucracy in governance, Byzantine cunning in commerce. But they did not become Byzantine subjects. They maintained a fierce independence, born from their origins as refugees, who owed nothing to any emperor or king. They elected their own leaders, local tribunes who answered to the people of each island. They built their own boats, established their own trade routes, created their own laws. The lagoon had given them more than safety. It had given them freedom. In the year 697, the various island communities came together and elected a single leader to represent them all. They called him the Doge, from the Latin dux, meaning leader. His name was Paoluccio Anafesto, and though history remembers little about him, his election marked the birth of a new political entity. The Republic of Venice had begun. It did not look like much. A collection of wooden huts on muddy islands, a few churches with brick walls, a population of fishermen and salt workers. No walls, no army, no fertile land. Just water and ambition, and the unshakable certainty that survival was its own form of conquest. The barbarians had driven them into the marshes. But, in the marshes, the Venetians found something the barbarians would never possess: a future. There is a place in Venice where the impossible became routine. It sprawls across nearly 50 acres of the eastern lagoon, hidden behind high brick walls and watchtowers, its entrances guarded by stone lions brought back from distant conquests. For centuries, it was the most closely guarded secret in Europe, a fortress of innovation where the fate of empires was hammered into shape by 10,000 workers labouring in shifts that never stopped. This is the Arsenale di Venezia, and in its prime, During the 15th and 16th centuries, it was the largest industrial complex in the world. To modernize, the arsenal would be recognizable as something entirely unprecedented in medieval Europe. It was, in essence, the world's first assembly line, the first mass production factory, the birthplace of industrial efficiency 500 years before the term existed. While other cities built ships, one at a time, slowly and inefficiently, Venice built them by the dozen, using standardized parts and specialized labor in a process that resembled nothing else in the pre-industrial world. The arsenal could produce a fully equipped warship in a single day. Not a small boat or a fishing vessel, but a galley, a sleek war machine over 100 feet long, powered by 150 rowers, armed with cannons and crossbows, capable of dominating the Mediterranean. When foreign dignitaries visited Venice, the arsenal was always part of the tour, a demonstration of Venetian power that left ambassadors stunned and terrified in equal measure. In 1474, King Henry III of France watched as a galley was constructed from raw timber to seaworthy vessel during the course of a state banquet. He arrived to see a bare keel. He left, hours later, to see a complete warship floating in the basin, ready for battle. The demonstration was not an illusion. It was standard procedure. But the arsenal was more than a shipyard. It was a fortress, a weapons factory, a rope-making workshop, a sail production centre, a storage depot for naval supplies, and a research facility for maritime innovation. Everything needed to build, equip, and maintain a fleet was produced within its walls. Timber was cut to exact specifications. Iron was forged into anchors, chains, and nails. Hemp was twisted into rope in buildings so long that workers had to walk nearly 1,000 feet from end to end. Canvas was woven into sails in workshops that filled entire warehouses. The organization was ruthless. Each section of the arsenal specialized in a single task. One crew installed keels, another attached ribs, another planked the hull, another caulked the seams with tar and oakum. As the ship moved through the complex, workers added masts, rigging, oars, cannons, provisions. By the time it reached the final basin, it was ready to sail. The workers themselves were a privileged class. Called arsenalotti, they were employed directly by the Venetian state, receiving steady wages, housing, and pensions, luxuries almost unheard of in medieval Europe. They wore distinctive red caps and enjoyed legal protections that set them apart from ordinary labourers. In exchange, they kept the secrets of the arsenal. To reveal ship designs or production methods to foreign powers was treason punishable by death, and the arsenal had secrets worth dying for. Venetian galleys were faster, more manoeuvrable, and more durable than anything their rivals could build. The hull design reduced drag, the rigging allowed for quick adjustments. The oars were balanced to precise weights, reducing fatigue for the rowers. Even the nails were standardized, each one identical in size and strength, allowing for quick repairs at sea. This was engineering as warfare, efficiency as empire. By the 14th century, the arsenal employed over 15,000 workers at peak production. During times of war, the forges burned day and night, the hammers never stopped, and galleys emerged from the gates in formations of 10 or 20 at a time, an armada built in weeks rather than years. It was here that Venice built the fleet that dominated the Adriatic, that protected trade routes stretching from London to the Black Sea, that fought the Ottomans to a standstill, that made the Republic untouchable for centuries. The arsenal was the industrial heart of the Venetian Empire, the secret engine that powered a maritime superpower, but its existence posed a question that historians still debate. How did a medieval city, without modern technology or machinery, without steam power or electrical tools, achieve industrial-scale production centuries before the Industrial Revolution? The answer lies in organization, not invention. Venice did not wait for technological breakthroughs. Instead, it perfected systems. It standardized components, streamlined workflows, specialized labor, and created feedback loops that constantly improved efficiency. The arsenal was not built by genius engineers, but by generations of shipwrights who learned from experience, documented their methods, and passed knowledge down through guilds and apprenticeships. This was innovation through iteration. Small improvements, accumulated over centuries, transformed shipbuilding from a craft into a science. The arsenal also revealed something fundamental about Venetian culture. This was a society that valued results over tradition, efficiency over artistry, and collective effort over individual glory. The ships produced here were not beautiful, not ornate. They were functional, reliable, deadly. They were tools, not treasures. And that pragmatism, that cold-eyed focus on what worked rather than what looked impressive, defined Venice at its height. Foreign visitors often remarked on the contrast between the arsenal and the rest of Venice. Outside its walls, the city was a riot of colour and decoration, palaces dripping with gold leaf, churches covered in mosaics, markets overflowing with silks and spices. But inside the arsenal, everything was stripped down to purpose. The buildings were plain brick, the workers wore simple clothes, the galleys were painted black, unadorned except for the red and gold banner of St. Mark. Beauty was for the city. Efficiency was for the empire. And when the empire needed ships, the arsenal delivered. When it needed weapons, the forges responded. When it needed rope, sails, anchors, oars, provisions, everything necessary to sustain a fleet thousands of miles from home, the arsenal provided. This was the machine that made Venice invincible. Not diplomacy, not wealth, not culture, but production. The ability to build faster, better, and cheaper than anyone else. The capacity to replace losses before enemies could celebrate victories. The arsenal was where Venice proved that power is not inherited, it is manufactured. News of the arsenal spread like a contagion through the courts of Europe. At first, it was dismissed as exaggeration, the kind of boastful rumour that merchants told to inflate their city's reputation. A warship built in a day? Impossible. A factory employing thousands? Absurd. A republic of traders commanding the largest navy in Christendom? Laughable. But then the ambassadors returned home with their reports, and the laughter died in their throats. The Genoese were the first to truly understand. Venice's bitter rivals, fellow maritime merchants who competed for every trade route and every commercial advantage, sent spies disguised as sailors and merchants into the Venetian lagoon. What they reported back shook the foundations of Genoese confidence. The arsenal was real, the production capacity was real, and Venice could replace its entire battle fleet faster than Genoa could repair a single damaged squadron. The response was immediate and desperate. Genoa poured resources into expanding its own shipyards, attempting to replicate Venetian methods. They failed. The problem was not money or materials, but culture. Genoa was a city of fierce individualists, of family rivalries and factional disputes. Cooperation on the Venetian scale was impossible. Each shipwright guarded his own methods. Each merchant house pursued its own interests. There was no collective will, no shared purpose strong enough to overcome centuries of competitive tradition. The failure haunted Genoa for generations. In 1379, the War of Chioggia brought the two republics to the brink of mutual destruction, and Genoa came within days of conquering Venice itself. But even in victory, Genoa could not sustain the effort. Venice rebuilt faster, reorganized faster, returned to the fight with fresh ships, while Genoese vessels rotted in harbour, waiting for repairs. The arsenal had saved the Republic. Other powers watched with different emotions. The Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling patchwork of German principalities and kingdoms, observed Venice with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Here was a city that owed no allegiance to emperor or pope, a republic that elected its own leaders and made its own laws, yet commanded more respect and wielded more influence than ancient dynasties, with bloodlines stretching back to Charlemagne. The emperors tried diplomacy first, offering titles and privileges in exchange for Venetian support. The Venetians accepted the honours and ignored the obligations. They were merchants, not vassals. They bowed to profit, not protocol. When diplomacy failed, the empire tried intimidation. Trade restrictions were imposed. Venetian merchants were harassed in German territories. Tariffs were raised to punishing levels. Venice responded by finding alternative routes, bribing officials, and quietly financing the emperor's enemies. The restrictions collapsed within years. The empire learned what others would learn: economic warfare against. Venice was suicide. France watched from the west with barely concealed envy. The French kings, among the most powerful monarchs in Europe, ruled vast territories and commanded enormous armies. Yet Venice, a city built on mud with no land army to speak of, possessed wealth that made French treasuries look provincial. Worse, Venice possessed something even more valuable than gold: information. Every ship that entered Venetian harbours brought news. Every merchant who traded in the Rialto carried rumours. Every diplomat who visited the Doge's palace whispered secrets. Venice was the nerve centre of Mediterranean intelligence, a place where information flowed like water and was just as valuable as spice or silk. The Venetians knew about crop failures in Egypt before the Egyptians did. They knew about political upheavals in Constantinople before the Byzantines announced them. They knew which kingdoms were stable and which were on the brink of collapse. This knowledge was weaponized. Venice offered loans to cash-strapped monarchs, then called them in at strategically inconvenient moments. It brokered peace treaties that subtly favoured Venetian interests. It played rivals against each other with such skill that conflicts seemed to erupt naturally, never with Venetian fingerprints visible. France fumed, but could do nothing. Venice was too useful to destroy and too slippery to control. Spain, rising to dominance in the 15th century, approached Venice with a different strategy. Rather than compete, Spain proposed partnership. The Spanish crown offered military alliances, joint ventures, shared profits from New World conquests. Venice listened politely and declined. The Venetians had watched empires rise and fall for 1,000 years. They knew that partnerships with powerful monarchies were traps. Today's ally was tomorrow's conqueror. Better to remain neutral, trade with everyone, and trust no one completely. The Ottoman Empire, expanding relentlessly from the east, viewed Venice with a complex mixture of respect and hostility. Here was a Christian power that nevertheless traded eagerly with Muslim merchants, that maintained diplomatic relations with the Sultan's court, that seemed more interested in profit than crusades. The Ottomans attacked Venetian colonies, besieged Venetian fortresses, and waged sporadic wars that lasted decades. Yet even in wartime, trade continued through unofficial channels. Venetian merchants sold weapons to Ottoman armies. Ottoman merchants bought Venetian glass and textiles. The wars were real, but so was the commerce. This pragmatism infuriated the rest of Christian Europe. The Pope issued bulls condemning Venice for trading with infidels. Other Italian cities accused Venice of treason against Christendom. Venice shrugged and continued doing business. Faith was important, but survival was essential. If survival required selling to Muslims, then Muslims would receive the finest Venetian products at competitive prices. Even England, distant and peripheral in medieval politics, felt the weight of Venetian influence. English wool was transported in Venetian ships. English merchants learned accounting methods from Venetian bankers. English kings borrowed money at Venetian interest rates. The relationship was unequal, and everyone knew it. England produced raw materials. Venice added value, handled logistics, controlled markets, and kept the profits. The pattern repeated across Europe and beyond. Every power that encountered Venice went through the same cycle. First, disbelief at Venetian capabilities. Second, attempts to compete or control. Third, grudging acceptance of Venetian dominance in maritime commerce. Fourth, a slow realization that Venice was not like other cities, that it operated by different rules, and that trying to defeat it was like trying to dam the tide. The arsenal was the symbol of this invincibility, but the reality went deeper. Venice had created a system, an entire way of organizing society around commerce and naval power that no rival could replicate without fundamentally transforming their own culture. And culture, unlike ships, could not be built in a day. So they watched and envied and feared. And Venice, aware of their gaze, built more ships. Venice should not have been a military power. Nothing in the logic of medieval Europe suggested that a city of shopkeepers and traders, a republic governed by merchant families, a state without feudal warriors or noble cavalry, could dominate the Mediterranean through force of arms. War was the domain of knights and kings, of professional soldiers and hereditary military castes. Merchants kept accounts, warriors kept swords. The categories were separate, fixed, immutable, yet Venice erased the distinction entirely. The same families that negotiated spice contracts in Alexandria commanded war fleets at Lepanto. The same men who calculated profit margins in the Rialto calculated naval tactics in the Adriatic. The Doge himself, the elected leader of the Republic, was often a former admiral who had spent decades at sea, leading battles, negotiating treaties, navigating storms both literal and political. In Venice, commerce and warfare were not separate vocations, but two expressions of the same fundamental skill. The skill was power. Venetian merchants understood something that escaped most of their contemporaries. Trade routes required protection. Markets required enforcement. Contracts required the threat of violence to maintain their validity. Profit, in the medieval world, was inseparable from force. A merchant who could not defend his goods was not a merchant, but a victim. A city that could not protect its ships was not a trading power, but a target. So Venice built a navy, not out of martial tradition, but out of commercial necessity. And having built a navy for defense, it discovered that navies could also be used for offense, for conquest, for the projection of power far beyond the lagoon. The transformation was gradual, but inexorable. In the 9th century, Venetian ships were primarily defensive, protecting the lagoon from Slavic pirates and Byzantine interference. By the 11th century, they were escorting merchant convoys across the Adriatic. By the 12th century, they were conquering coastal cities in Dalmatia, establishing Venetian colonies that served as trading posts and naval bases. By the 13th century, they were sacking Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade remains one of the most audacious commercial betrayals in history. In the year 1202, European nobles gathered in Venice to launch a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. They needed ships to transport their armies across the Mediterranean. Venice agreed to provide the fleet for a price. 85,000 silver marks, plus half of all territories conquered during the Crusade. The Crusaders could not pay, their treasuries were insufficient. They were trapped in Venice, indebted to the Republic, unable to proceed and unwilling to turn back. The Venetian Doge at the time, Enrico Dandolo, was 90 years old and blind, but his mind remained sharp as Damascene steel. He offered a solution. The Crusaders would help Venice recapture Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast that had rebelled against Venetian control. In exchange, the debt would be postponed. The Crusaders agreed. They attacked Zara. The Pope excommunicated them for assaulting a Christian city. They did not care. Venetian pragmatism was contagious, but Dandolo was not finished. He redirected the entire crusade away from Jerusalem toward Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the wealthiest Christian city in the world. His reasons were partly political. The Byzantines had reneged on previous agreements with Venice, but mostly economic. Constantinople was a treasure house waiting to be plundered. In 1204, the Crusaders stormed the Krak city. For 3 days, they looted palaces, churches, libraries, and homes. Gold, silver, jewels, relics, artworks, manuscripts, everything of value was seized. Horses were stabled in the Hagia Sophia. Altars were stripped of their decorations. The Byzantine Empire, which had endured for 1,000 years, collapsed into chaos. Venice took half. The bronze horses that now stand above the entrance to San Marco Basilica were ripped from the Hippodrome in Constantinople. The treasury of San Marco overflowed with relics, icons, and sacred objects stolen from Byzantine churches. Entire neighborhoods in Venice were rebuilt with marble columns and carved capitals transported across the Adriatic. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem, but it made Venice the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. This was not warfare, as Europeans understood it. There were no chivalric codes, no honourable single combat, no respect for tradition or sanctity. This was war as business, conquest as investment, holy crusade as corporate raid. The Venetians did not apologise. They counted their profits and commissioned mosaics to celebrate their victories. The contradiction deepened over the following centuries. Venice maintained permanent ambassadors in foreign courts, pioneering modern diplomacy. Yet those same ambassadors were often spies, gathering intelligence on military capabilities and political weaknesses. Venice signed peace treaties with Muslim powers, while simultaneously supplying Christian kingdoms with weapons. It declared neutrality in conflicts between France and Spain, then quietly sold supplies to whichever side paid better prices. Other powers called this hypocrisy. Venice called it survival. The Republic never possessed a large standing army. Its territories on the Italian mainland were defended by hired mercenaries, condottieri, who fought for pay rather than patriotism. Yet its navy was crewed by Venetians, by citizens who rowed the galleys and manned the cannons, who understood that their prosperity depended on controlling the seas. Every merchant house was expected to contribute ships during wartime. Every young nobleman was expected to serve at sea, learning navigation and naval tactics as part of his education. This created a unique hybrid culture. Venetian nobles were literate and numerate, skilled in accounting and law, fluent in multiple languages. They were also sailors, fighters, administrators of distant colonies. They negotiated trade agreements in the morning and commanded fleets in the afternoon. They wore silk robes in the Senate and armour on the quarterdeck. They were simultaneously the most sophisticated diplomats in Europe and the most ruthless naval commanders in the Mediterranean. The contradiction was not a weakness. It was Venice's greatest strength. While other powers were limited by rigid social categories, Venice was flexible, adaptive, capable of responding to threats and opportunities with equal speed. A merchant could become an admiral could become a diplomat could become doge. Talent and results mattered more than birth or tradition. This was heresy to feudal Europe, where status was inherited and roles were fixed. But Venice was not feudal. It was something else entirely, a meritocracy of the ruthless, a republic of pragmatists, an empire built not on land or lineage, but on the simple recognition that power flows to those willing to seize it, regardless of whether they carry a sword or a ledger. Often, in Venice, they carried both. For centuries, historians have tried to explain Venice. How did a collection of refugees in a malarial swamp become the wealthiest republic in Christendom? How did a city without natural resources, without fresh water or farmland or forests, dominate Mediterranean trade for half a millennium? How did merchants with no military tradition defeat the combined fleets of the Ottoman Empire at Lepanto? The question has inspired theories ranging from the geographical to the mystical, from the coldly economic to the romantically cultural. Each theory contains truth. None contains the whole answer. The geographic theory is the most obvious. Venice's location was simultaneously its greatest vulnerability and its supreme advantage. The lagoon provided natural defence against land invasion, forcing the Venetians to develop maritime skills that became the foundation of their empire. The city sat at the northwestern edge of the Adriatic, perfectly positioned to control trade routes between northern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Rivers flowing down from the Alps gave Venice access to German markets. The Adriatic itself was a Venetian lake for centuries, every port along its coasts either allied with or subordinate to the Republic. Geography also shaped Venetian culture. A city built on water could not afford the feudal system that dominated mainland Europe. There was no land to grant to vassals, no estates to inherit, no agricultural base to support a warrior aristocracy. everyone in Venice, from the Doge to the lowest fisherman, depended on trade. This created a society uniquely focused on commerce, where business acumen was valued above military prowess, where success was measured in ducats rather than domains. But geography alone cannot explain Venice. Other coastal cities enjoyed similar advantages. Genoa had an excellent harbour. Pisa controlled the mouth of the Arno. Amalfi commanded southern Italian trade routes. Yet none of them achieved what Venice achieved, and all of them eventually declined, while Venice endured. The institutional theory offers a different explanation. Venice developed political structures that were uniquely stable and adaptable. The Doge was elected for life, providing continuity, but his power was limited by councils and committees that represented the merchant aristocracy. No single family could dominate. No individual could become a dictator. The system was designed to prevent tyranny while enabling efficient decision-making. Laws were written down and publicly displayed. Contracts were enforced. Property rights were protected. Corruption existed, but was prosecuted when discovered. This institutional framework created trust, and trust enabled commerce on a scale impossible in less stable societies. A Venetian merchant could send goods to Alexandria on credit, confident that contracts would be honoured and disputes would be adjudicated fairly. Foreign traders preferred doing business in Venice because the rules were clear and consistently applied. Capital flowed to Venice because investors knew their assets were secure. Yet institutions do not create themselves. Why did Venice develop these structures, while other cities remained mired in factional violence and arbitrary rule? The cultural theory suggests that Venetian identity itself was the key. The founding refugees had no shared history, no common noble lineage, no inherited hierarchy. They were united only by their decision to build a new society in the lagoon. This created a culture of pragmatism, a willingness to adopt whatever worked regardless of tradition or precedent. Venetians borrowed freely from every civilization they encountered. They adopted Byzantine administrative techniques, Islamic accounting methods, German banking practices, and innovations from across their trading network. They were cosmopolitan by necessity, multilingual by habit, and deeply skeptical of ideological purity. What mattered was results. If a method produced profit, it was adopted. If a tradition hindered efficiency, it was abandoned. This cultural flexibility extended to religion. Venice was Catholic, but its relationship with the papacy was famously contentious. The Republic defied papal authority when it conflicted with Venetian interests. It traded with Muslims despite church prohibitions. It protected Jews and Greeks and Armenians because they contributed to commerce. The Inquisition existed in Venice, but was notably less zealous than in Spain or Rome. Burning merchants for heresy was bad for business. The economic theory focuses on salt. In the early medieval period, Venice controlled salt production in the northern Adriatic. Salt was essential for food preservation, and therefore essential for survival. The salt monopoly provided Venice with reliable income that funded its early expansion. Profits from salt were invested in ships. Ships enabled trade. Trade generated more profits, which were invested in more ships, in colonies, in warehouses, in the arsenal. The positive feedback loop transformed a regional salt producer into a global commercial empire. But salt alone does not explain Venice's dominance in luxury goods. By the 13th century, Venice was the primary conduit for spices, silk, and precious goods flowing from Asia to Europe. The spice trade was fantastically profitable, with markups of 500% or more. A single, successful spice voyage could make a merchant's fortune. Venice controlled this trade not through production but through logistics, through superior ships, and established contacts in eastern ports, through the ability to move goods faster and more reliably than any competitor. The network theory emphasizes these connections. Venice was not just a city, but a web of relationships spanning the Mediterranean and beyond. Venetian merchant colonies in Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Black Sea ports provided local knowledge and trading infrastructure. Venetian bankers financed enterprises across Europe. Venetian diplomats maintained channels of communication with every significant power. Information flowed through this network constantly, giving Venice advance warning of market shifts, political upheavals, and commercial opportunities. Yet perhaps the most controversial theory is the simplest. Violence. Venice rose to power because it was willing to use force more ruthlessly than its rivals. It conquered ports, eliminated competitors, and enforced monopolies with naval might. The sack of Constantinople was not an aberration, but a revelation of Venetian character. Behind the silk robes and diplomatic niceties was a republic built on calculated aggression, on the willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain dominance. Modern historians tend to reject single-cause explanations. The rise of Venice was probably overdetermined, the result of geography and institutions, and culture and economics and violence working in combination, each factor reinforcing the others. The lagoon location created the need for maritime skills. Maritime skills enabled trade. Trade generated wealth. Wealth funded institutions. Institutions protected property. Property protection attracted capital. Capital funded the arsenal. The arsenal produced military power. Military power protected trade routes. Protected trade generated more wealth. The cycle was self-reinforcing, almost impossible to break from outside. And once established, it persisted for centuries, through plagues and wars and commercial crises, through the fall of Byzantium and the rise of the Ottomans, through changes in technology and religion and politics. Venice rose because everything aligned: geography, culture, institutions, economics, and will. Remove any single factor, and the story might have ended differently. But in the actual history that unfolded, all the factors came together in one impossible city built on wooden stakes in a lagoon, and for half a millennium, that was enough. If you want to understand Venice, follow the salt. Not the spices, not the silk, not the gold or the jewels that glittered in Rialto markets. Those came later, symbols of an empire already established. But in the beginning, before the palaces and the arsenal and the conquest of Constantinople, there was only salt. White crystals harvested from evaporation ponds in the lagoon, packed into barrels, loaded onto flat-bottomed boats, and shipped up rivers and across mountains to markets that needed it desperately. Salt was survival. Without refrigeration, without canning, without any method of long-term food preservation, except drying, salting, or smoking, salt was the difference between feast and famine, between a city that could store food through winter and a population that starved when harvests failed. Meat spoiled in days without salt, fish rotted in hours, cheese could not be aged, butter turned rancid. Salt was not a luxury, but a necessity, as essential as water or grain, and Venice controlled it. The lagoon was perfect for salt production. Shallow pools separated from the open sea by sandy barriers, heated by the Italian sun, naturally concentrated by evaporation. The process was simple and ancient. Workers channeled seawater into prepared basins, let the sun do its work, then harvested the crystallized salt left behind. The yield was enormous. The labor was minimal. The profits were extraordinary. By the 8th century, Venetian salt was flowing north along the Po River into the heart of northern Italy, east along the Dalmatian coast, west toward Ravenna and beyond. Small boats carried it at first, then larger vessels as demand grew. Salt routes became trade routes. Trade routes became relationships. Relationships became power. The genius of early Venice was recognizing that controlling salt production was not enough. They had to control distribution as well. So they built alliances with cities along the Po River, offering favorable prices in exchange for exclusive trading rights. They established warehouses at key river junctions, ensuring that all salt moving through northern Italy passed through Venetian hands. They negotiated with monasteries and nobles who controlled river crossings, paying tolls in exchange for guaranteed passage. When negotiation failed, they used force. Rival salt producers were driven out of business through aggressive pricing or outright intimidation. cities that tried to bypass Venetian middlemen found their shipments mysteriously disappearing or arriving damaged. Pirates who attacked Venetian salt convoys were hunted down with a ferocity that made future raids suicidal. Venice was not brutal for the sake of cruelty, but for the sake of monopoly. The salt monopoly generated steady income that funded everything else. While other medieval cities struggled with unpredictable tax revenues and feudal obligations, Venice had a reliable cash flow. Salt sold every day, every week, every year. The profits were invested in ships, which enabled trade in other goods. By the 10th century, Venetian merchants were carrying not just salt, but timber, iron, grain, wine, and slaves. The latter, a disturbing but lucrative business that Venice engaged in for centuries before gradually abandoning it as other revenue sources proved more stable. But salt remained the foundation. Even as Venice expanded into luxury trade, the salt routes continued operating, generating baseline profits that cushioned the Republic against market fluctuations. When spice voyages failed or wars disrupted trade, salt income kept the city solvent. It was boring, unglamorous work, but it was the bedrock of Venetian wealth. Following the salt roads today means tracing forgotten waterways through northern Italy. Many of the rivers that once carried Venetian boats have been dammed or diverted. The warehouses have crumbled or been converted to other uses. But the roots remain visible in the geography, in the placement of towns that grew up around river crossings, in the old roads that parallel former waterways, in the churches built with donations from salt merchants who made fortunes transporting barrels upstream. The salt ponds themselves have mostly disappeared. As Venice grew, the lagoon was reclaimed for building. Mud flats were filled in, channels were dredged. The salt industry moved to industrial facilities on the mainland, losing the artisanal character that had defined it for centuries. Today, only a few traditional salt ponds remain, operated as historical curiosities rather than commercial enterprises. But in their time, those ponds were the engine of empire. Each harvest represented cash in Venetian hands. Each barrel represented connections maintained, routes secured, competitors suppressed. The salt trade was not romantic or exciting, but it was relentless and profitable, the kind of steady business that builds dynasties. Historians have compared Venice's salt monopoly to modern oil cartels, and the comparison is apt. Like oil, salt was a commodity everyone needed. Like oil states, Venice used monopoly power to extract maximum profit, while maintaining just enough supply to keep customers dependent. Like oil revenues, salt profits funded military expansion that protected the monopoly and acquired new resources. But unlike oil, salt was renewable. The lagoon produced it endlessly. The sun evaporated, seawater for free. The only inputs were labour and time, and Venice had both in abundance. This made the salt trade sustainable in ways that mining or forestry could never be. The resource did not deplete. The supply did not run out. As long as the sun shone and the sea remained salty, Venice could continue harvesting wealth from the lagoon. The psychological impact was profound. Venice learned early that control over essential resources translated into political power. This lesson shaped centuries of Venetian strategy. When they moved into the spice trade, they sought monopolies. When they conquered territories, they looked for trade choke points. When they negotiated treaties, they demanded exclusive rights. The salt monopoly was not just profitable, it was instructive, a masterclass in economic dominance that Venice applied to every subsequent venture. By the 13th century, salt revenues were a smaller percentage of Venetian income, dwarfed by profits from luxury goods and banking. But the infrastructure built by the salt trade remained. The ships, the warehouses, the network of contacts, the established trade routes, all originated in the salt business and were adapted to carry other goods. Venice did not abandon salt so much as transcend it, building new industries on foundations of white crystals harvested from shallow lagoon pools. The salt roads led everywhere. To the spice ports of the East, to the banking houses of Northern Europe, to the arsenal and the fleets it produced, to the palaces lining the Grand Canal, to empire itself. It all began with salt. Everything else followed. Stand in the Piazza San Marco on a bright morning and look east toward the basilica. The facade overwhelms. 5 great domes rise above walls covered in marble and mosaics, their surfaces shimmering gold in the sunlight. Columns of purple porphyry and green serpentine, stolen from ancient temples and Byzantine palaces, frame the entrances. Above the central portal, 4 bronze horses prance frozen in mid-stride, their muscles rendered in such detail that you can almost hear them breathing. The entire structure seems less like architecture and more like a jewel box, a reliquary built at the scale of a cathedral. This is the Basilica di San Marco, and every stone, every mosaic, every column tells the story of Venice's rise to power. The church was built to house a corpse. Not just any corpse, but the body of St. Mark the Evangelist, author of the Second Gospel, one of the most important figures in early Christianity. According to Venetian tradition, Mark had visited the Lagoon Islands in the 1st century, receiving a vision that promised his body would one day rest here. That prophecy conveniently justified what happened 8 centuries later. In the year 828, 2 Venetian merchants, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, were trading in Alexandria, Egypt. The city was under Muslim rule, and rumours suggested that the local caliph planned to demolish old churches to build a palace. The Church of St. Mark stood in the path of construction. The saint's remains, preserved in the church crypt, faced desecration or destruction. The merchants saw an opportunity. They convinced the Egyptian monks guarding the tomb that Mark's body would be safer in Venice. Whether the monks believed this or were simply bribed remains unclear. What is certain is that the merchants smuggled the corpse out of Alexandria, hidden under layers of pork in a barrel, knowing that Muslim customs officials would not search too carefully through forbidden meat. The theft was successful. The body arrived in Venice to enormous celebration. The Doge ordered the construction of a great church to house the relic. St. Mark replaced the previous patron saint, Theodore, who was quietly demoted. The winged lion that symbolized Mark became the symbol of Venice itself, appearing on flags, coins, and buildings throughout the expanding Venetian Empire. A stolen body became the foundation of national identity. The original church, built in 832, was destroyed by fire. The structure standing today was begun in 1063, modelled directly on the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. This was deliberate. Venice wanted to announce its connection to Byzantine glory, to claim inheritance of Eastern imperial splendour. The plan was Greek cross, the domes were Byzantine, the decoration was Eastern. Venice was declaring itself the new Rome, the new Constantinople, the inheritor of Christian civilization. But the basilica is more than architectural imitation. It is a catalogue of conquest, a museum of plunder, physical evidence of Venetian reach across the Mediterranean world. Nearly every decorative element was imported or stolen. The 4 bronze horses above the entrance came from Constantinople, seized during the 4th Crusade. They had originally stood in the Hippodrome, cast in the 4th century, perhaps earlier. Venetian crusaders ripped them from their pedestals and shipped them across the Adriatic as trophies. The columns supporting the facade were stripped from ruined temples and Byzantine palaces. Some are Roman, carved in the 1st or 2nd century. Others are Byzantine, cut from quarries in Greece or Asia Minor. The carved capitals show a mixture of styles. Corinthian acanthus leaves next to Byzantine basket weaves, evidence of centuries and cultures pillaged and repurposed. Venice cared nothing for historical preservation. If it was beautiful and portable, it belonged in San Marco. Inside, the mosaics cover over 80,000 square feet of ceiling and wall space, one of the largest mosaic programs in the Christian world. Gold tesserae, small glass tiles backed with gold leaf, create surfaces that seem to glow with interior light. Biblical scenes unfold across the domes and vaults: Genesis and Exodus, the life of Christ, the Acts of the Apostles, all rendered in the Byzantine style with elongated figures and symbolic rather than realistic representation. But hidden among the biblical narratives are scenes celebrating Venice itself. In the northern transept, mosaics depict the arrival of St. Mark's body, showing the theft, presented as pious rescue, and the construction of the basilica. Venetian merchants appear alongside saints. Venetian ships sail alongside miracles. The sacred and the commercial merge seamlessly, reflecting Venetian values where profit and piety were never truly separate. The treasury holds even more evidence of Venetian power: chalices and patens looted from Constantinople, reliquaries containing fragments of saints and martyrs, icons in gold and enamel, rock crystal vessels carved in Fatimid Egypt, Islamic metalwork inlaid with silver, Byzantine manuscripts with jeweled covers. The collection represents the greatest concentration of Byzantine art outside Istanbul, most of it stolen during the Fourth Crusade. Modern visitors sometimes express discomfort at this reality. San Marco is beautiful, but its beauty is built on theft. Every precious object has a provenance that begins with seized, or taken, or acquired during the conquest of. The basilica is simultaneously a masterpiece of religious art and a monument to medieval plunder. But this is exactly what makes it valuable as historical evidence. San Marco proves that Venice was not just a trading power, but a conquering empire. It demonstrates Venetian reach across the Mediterranean, from Egypt to Constantinople to the shores of the Black Sea. It shows Venetian priorities, the willingness to spend enormous resources on a church that would advertise the Republic's wealth and power to every visitor. It reveals Venetian adaptability, taking Byzantine forms and filling them with Venetian content, creating something that was both imitation and innovation. The basilica also proves something more subtle. Venice understood symbolism. The theft of St. Mark's body was not just about acquiring a holy relic. It was about claiming divine sanction for the Republic's existence. If Mark's body rested in Venice, then Venice must be blessed by God. If the saint chose Venice as his final resting place, then Venice was destined for greatness. The circular logic was perfect and politically brilliant. For 1,000 years, every doge was inaugurated in San Marco. Every major treaty was signed there. Every military victory was celebrated there. The basilica was not separate from the state, but integral to it, the spiritual heart of a commercial empire, the sacred justification for centuries of expansion and conquest. Today, tourists flood through San Marco by the thousands, snapping photos of the mosaics and the bronze horses. Most do not know the stories behind what they see, but the evidence remains, written in gold and marble and stolen treasure, testimony to an empire that rose from nothing and inscribed its glory in the most permanent materials it could find. The stones remember, even if the visitors forget. Beneath the official histories, beneath the chronicles written by Venetian patricians celebrating their republic's glory, lies a different Venice. This is the Venice of secrets, of whispered negotiations in dark canals, of fortunes built on businesses never mentioned in polite company, of methods that worked but could not be publicly acknowledged. For centuries, Venice presented itself as a Christian republic, a defender of faith, a mercantile state operating within the moral boundaries of medieval Christendom. The reality was considerably more complex, considerably darker, and considerably more interesting. The slave trade is where the official narrative and the hidden truth diverge most dramatically. Venetian merchants dealt in human beings for centuries, trafficking primarily in Slavic peoples from the Balkans and the Black Sea region. The word slave itself derives from Slav, a linguistic fossil recording this brutal commerce. Young men and women were purchased in Balkan markets, transported to Venice, then resold to buyers throughout the Mediterranean, particularly in Muslim Egypt and Syria, where they fetched high prices. Venetian law acknowledged this trade, but regulated it carefully. Slaves could not be Christians, at least not officially. If a slave converted to Christianity, they theoretically became free. Though this rule was often ignored when convenient, slaves could not be transported through Venice during certain religious festivals. Records had to be kept. Taxes had to be paid. The trade was not hidden exactly, but it was not celebrated either. No mosaics in San Marco depicted slave auctions. No Venetian merchant family boasted about fortunes built on human trafficking. Yet the wealth was real. Slave trading generated consistent profits with relatively low risk. A slave purchased for 10 ducats in the Balkans might sell for 30 or 40 in Alexandria. The margins were excellent. The demand was stable. For several centuries, until the trade gradually declined in the 14th and 15th centuries, slavery was a core component of Venetian commerce, mentioned casually in account books, but absent from public monuments. The relationship with Islam is another area where official history smooths over uncomfortable realities. Venice fought wars against Muslim powers, particularly the Ottomans. Venetian galleys battled Ottoman fleets. Venetian colonies resisted Ottoman sieges. This military conflict was real and often brutal, but it coexisted with extensive commercial cooperation that both sides found mutually beneficial. Venetian merchants sold weapons to Muslim armies, including cannons and gunpowder that would later be used against Christian fortresses. They sold timber for shipbuilding, knowing the ships would carry Ottoman soldiers. They provided strategic materials that strengthened Venice's enemies because the profits were too substantial to refuse. Venice maintained permanent trading stations in Alexandria, Damascus, and Constantinople under Ottoman rule, paying taxes to Muslim authorities and operating within Islamic law when necessary. The papacy repeatedly condemned this commerce, issuing bulls that threatened excommunication for Christians who traded strategic goods with Muslims. Venice ignored the threats. When pressed, Venetian ambassadors explained that cutting off trade with the Islamic world would destroy the Republic's economy. They promised to be more careful. Then they continued exactly as before. The Pope could excommunicate Venice, but he could not make the city's merchants abandon their most profitable markets. This pragmatic amorality extended to religion more broadly. Venice was Catholic, but its Catholicism was flexible, subordinate to political necessity. When Venice wanted something from the Pope, it emphasized its role as a defender of Christendom. When the Pope wanted something from Venice, the Republic suddenly discovered reasons why compliance was impossible. Venice protected Jewish communities because Jewish merchants and bankers contributed to commerce. It tolerated Greek Orthodox Christians because they facilitated trade with the Eastern Mediterranean. It even maintained diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Sultan while simultaneously funding holy leagues against Ottoman expansion. The intellectual climate was similarly unorthodox. Venetian presses printed books that would have been banned elsewhere. Not obviously heretical works, nothing that directly challenged Catholic doctrine, but books that pushed boundaries, that explored classical pagan philosophy, that examined Arab science and mathematics, that translated Greek texts. The Church preferred forgotten. Venice became a centre of Renaissance humanism, partly because its merchants understood that ideas were profitable, that books sold well, and that censorship hindered business. The political system, celebrated for its stability, operated on mechanisms rarely discussed in official chronicles. The Council of Ten, supposedly guardians of the Republic's security, functioned as a secret police force. They employed informants throughout Venice and in foreign cities. They opened diplomatic correspondence. They arrested citizens without public trial. They executed traitors, sometimes publicly but often quietly, bodies disappearing into the lagoon at night without explanation or announcement. Venetians learned to be careful about what they said and to whom they said it. Denunciation boxes were built into the walls of the Doge's palace, slots where anonymous accusations could be deposited. The council investigated every accusation. Most were dismissed, but some led to trials, torture, imprisonment, or death. The system generated fear, which generated compliance, which generated stability. But it was not the transparent, law-governed republic that Venice liked to claim. Corruption was endemic, though carefully managed. Government officials took bribes, but too much corruption attracted attention from the Council of Ten. Merchants smuggled goods to avoid customs duties, but getting caught meant ruinous fines. Nobles manipulated elections through complex systems of favours and obligations, but naked bribery was punished. Venice was not unusually corrupt by medieval standards, but neither was it the meritocratic paradise described in patriotic histories. The deeper mystery is not that these darker realities existed. Most medieval states operated similarly, but that Venice managed them so effectively. The slave trade generated wealth without destabilizing society. The weapons trade with Muslims enriched Venice without triggering successful papal intervention. The secret police maintained order without descending into arbitrary terror. The corruption stayed within manageable bounds. The flexibility on religious matters never quite crossed the line into heresy. Venice succeeded not despite its moral compromises, but because of them. While other states crippled themselves with ideological purity or factional violence, Venice pragmatically pursued whatever worked. The official histories celebrated piety and republican virtue because that was good marketing. The actual Venice was harder, colder, more calculating, and ultimately more successful than the legends suggested. The mystery is not what Venice did. The mystery is how Venice did it without destroying itself in the process. That balance between public morality and private necessity, between celebrated values and actual practices, between the Venice of monuments and the Venice of account books, that was the real secret. That was the deeper truth hidden beneath the golden mosaics and the bronze horses. And that truth was never written in stone. The date was May 29th, 1453. In Constantinople, the massive Theodosian walls, which had protected the city for over 1,000 years, finally fell. Ottoman cannons had pounded the fortifications for weeks, each blast sending stone and masonry cascading into the defensive moat. At dawn, Mehmed II's elite janissaries poured through the breaches, fighting hand-to-hand through the streets against the last defenders of the Byzantine Empire. By midday, it was over. The Emperor Constantine XI died fighting in the chaos. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium was torn down. The crescent rose over the Hagia Sophia. 1,500 miles away in Venice, the news arrived like a death sentence. For 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the eastern anchor of Mediterranean trade, the great market connecting Asia and Europe, the city where silk roads ended and sea routes began. Venetian merchants had maintained colonies in Constantinople since the 11th century, entire neighbourhoods where Italian was spoken, and deals were negotiated in ducats rather than Byzantine gold. The relationship had been complicated, marked by mutual suspicion and occasional violence, but it had been profitable. Now the city was Ottoman. Venice faced a choice that would define its future: accept the new reality and negotiate with the Ottoman Empire, or resist and risk being swept away by the rising Muslim power. Either path led into unknown territory. Either choice would transform the Republic. The initial response was shock. The Senate met in emergency session. Merchants whose entire fortunes depended on the Constantinople trade demanded military action. Naval commanders urged immediate war. The Doge, Francesco Foscari, old and exhausted after 3 decades in power, counselled caution. Venice could not defeat the Ottoman Empire alone. A crusade might be organised, but crusades had failed before. The Republic had to think practically. Practical thinking meant accepting Ottoman conquest. Within months, Venetian ambassadors arrived at Mehmed's court, offering congratulations on his victory and proposing trade agreements. The Ottomans, eager to restore commercial activity in their new capital, accepted. Venetian merchants returned to Constantinople, now called Istanbul, and resumed business under Ottoman authority. The transition was astonishingly smooth. Shops reopened, goods flowed, profits continued. But everything had changed beneath the surface. Venice no longer operated from a position of strength in the eastern Mediterranean. The old Byzantine Empire had been weak, manipulable, vulnerable to Venetian pressure. The Ottoman Empire was none of these things. It was expansionist, militarily powerful, and increasingly interested in dominating the very trade routes Venice had controlled for centuries. The balance of power had shifted, and Venice would spend the next 200 years struggling to adapt. The immediate consequence was war. Not with the Ottomans directly, not yet, but with other Italian powers. Venice had relied on its eastern trade for so much wealth that it needed to secure its position closer to home. In the 1454, less than a year after Constantinople's fall, Venice invaded territories on the Italian mainland, fighting Milan and Florence for control of northern Italian trade routes. The wars dragged on for decades, consuming resources and attention, creating enemies that would haunt Venice for generations. The long-term consequence was strategic reorientation. Venice began looking westward and southward rather than eastward. Investment poured into the arsenal to build larger fleets capable of protecting Mediterranean trade routes without relying on Byzantine partnerships. Venetian diplomats cultivated relationships with Spain and France, balancing their power against both Ottoman expansion and Italian rivals. The Republic diversified its commercial activities, developing industries at home rather than depending entirely on imports and re-export trade. But the psychological impact was perhaps most profound. The fall of Constantinople shattered the illusion of Christian invincibility in the East. For centuries, Venice had operated on the assumption that Christendom, however fractured, would ultimately prevail over Islam. Now that assumption lay in ruins, along with the Theodosian walls. The Ottomans were not some distant threat but an immediate neighbour, capable of projecting power throughout the Mediterranean, capable of threatening Venice itself. Fear became policy. Venice fortified its colonial possessions, transforming trading posts into fortresses. Crete, Cyprus, and the Dalmatian ports received massive defensive investments. Engineers designed walls capable of withstanding artillery bombardment. Garrisons were expanded. Supply chains were secured. Venice transformed from a commercial power that happened to have a navy into a military power that happened to conduct trade. The cost was enormous. Military spending consumed half the government budget by the late 15th century. Taxes rose. Merchant profits declined. The Republic borrowed money at increasing interest rates to finance fortifications and fleets. The arsenal expanded again, employing over 15,000 workers at peak production. Venice was becoming a garrison state, its commercial character gradually subordinated to military necessity. Yet even in decline, Venice remained formidable. The fleet that assembled at Lepanto in 1571 to fight the Ottomans was the largest Christian armada ever assembled in the Mediterranean, over 200 galleys carrying 30,000 soldiers. The victory at Lepanto, though strategically inconclusive, demonstrated that Venice could still match the Ottoman navy in battle. The Republic might no longer dominate the eastern Mediterranean, but neither could it be ignored or dismissed. The fall of Constantinople marked the beginning of Venice's long, slow retreat from empire. Not immediate collapse, not sudden defeat, but gradual contraction over centuries. Colonies were lost one by one. Trade routes were redirected, profits declined. The arsenal built fewer ships. The population of Venice itself began shrinking as opportunities contracted. By the 17th century, Venice was increasingly peripheral to European politics, a minor player in conflicts dominated by Spain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. But in 1453, as news of Constantinople's fall spread through Venice, none of this was clear. The future remained uncertain, frightening, full of danger and possibility. The Venetians did what they had always done. They adapted, they negotiated, they built ships, they prepared for war, they sought profit wherever it could be found. The world had changed. The question was whether Venice could change fast enough to survive in it. The answer would take centuries to reveal itself. But the turning point had arrived. Everything that came after would be shaped by what happened when the Ottoman cannons finally breached the walls of Constantinople, and the Byzantine Empire disappeared from history, taking with it the old order of the Mediterranean world. Venice would never be the same. The decades following Constantinople's fall were years of transformation and loss. Venice did not collapse. That would have been too dramatic, too clean. Instead, the Republic experienced something more subtle and more painful, a gradual recognition that the world it had dominated for centuries was slipping away, that the rules of Mediterranean commerce were being rewritten by forces beyond Venetian control, that power was shifting from maritime city-states to continental empires with resources Venice could never match. The first consequence was territorial. Venice had always maintained a delicate balance between its maritime empire, the colonies and trading posts scattered across the Mediterranean, and its mainland territories, the cities and countryside of northeastern Italy. After Constantinople fell, this balance became unsustainable. The eastern colonies grew more expensive to defend. The Ottoman Empire pressed against them relentlessly. Crete required constant military reinforcement. Cyprus faced repeated threats. The Aegean Islands became isolated outposts rather than links in a profitable network. Meanwhile, Venice's Italian rivals sensed weakness. Milan, Florence, and the Papal States all sought to expand at Venetian expense. Wars erupted with exhausting regularity. In 1499, the League of Cambrai united France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy against Venice, an alliance so powerful it should have destroyed the Republic entirely. Venice lost nearly all its mainland territories in a single catastrophic military campaign. Cities that had been Venetian for generations opened their gates to invading armies without resistance. Yet Venice survived. Through diplomacy, bribery, and strategic concessions, the Republic broke the League apart. France was turned against Spain. The Pope was placated with territorial gifts. Within a few years, Venice had recovered much of what it lost, but the recovery was Pyrrhic. The wars had demonstrated Venetian vulnerability. Everyone now knew the Republic could be beaten on land, that its armies were inferior to those of the great powers, that its survival depended on keeping enemies divided rather than defeating them in battle. The second consequence was economic. The old trade routes through the eastern Mediterranean remained open, but they became more dangerous and less profitable. Ottoman customs duties cut into margins. Competition from other European merchants intensified. Worst of all, Portuguese explorers discovered a sea route to India around Africa, bypassing the Mediterranean entirely. Spices that once flowed through Venetian warehouses now sailed directly from Goa to Lisbon. The monopoly that had made Venice wealthy for 3 centuries was broken. Venetian merchants attempted to adapt. They invested in new industries: glass-making on Murano, silk production, book printing, luxury goods manufacturing. The city became famous for its craftsmanship, for products, rather than intermediary trade. But manufacturing could not generate wealth at the scale of the spice monopoly. The profits were solid but unspectacular. Venice remained rich by most standards, but it was no longer the wealthiest city in Europe. That distinction was passing to Antwerp, to London, to cities on the Atlantic, with access to the New World. The third consequence was demographic. Venice's population had peaked at around 180,000 in the early 16th century. Then came plague, the same recurring nightmare that had devastated Europe for 2 centuries. But in Venice, surrounded by water with its dense population and heavy maritime traffic, plague hit with particular ferocity. The outbreak of 1575 killed 50,000 people, nearly a third of the city's population. Bodies were transported to plague islands in the lagoon and buried in mass graves. Entire families disappeared, neighbourhoods emptied. The population recovered slowly, but it never regained its former peak. By the 17th century, Venice was smaller, older, less dynamic. Young people emigrated to seek opportunities elsewhere. Merchant families declined or died out. The Senate, once filled with aggressive entrepreneurs, became dominated by cautious aristocrats, more interested in preserving what remained than in pursuing new ventures. Venice was becoming a museum of its own past, beautiful but static, celebrated but increasingly irrelevant. The fourth consequence was cultural, though it took decades to become apparent. As Venice's political and economic power declined, its investment in art and culture intensified. This was partly compensation, a way of maintaining prestige when military and commercial dominance faded. But it was also genuine. Venetian wealth, even in decline, remained substantial, and that wealth poured into painting, music, architecture, theatre, and literature. The 16th century produced Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese, painters whose mastery of colour and light defined Venetian art. Their canvases filled churches and palaces, enormous compositions celebrating religious themes with a sensuality that scandalised more austere Christians. The colours glowed, reds and golds and deep blues that seemed to capture the light reflecting off the lagoon itself. Venice might be losing colonies, but it was winning the cultural competition. Palladio transformed Venetian architecture, designing churches and villas that combined classical proportions with innovative engineering. His buildings were mathematical, harmonious, perfect in their ratios and relationships. They represented Venetian values in stone, order, and beauty emerging from careful calculation rather than divine inspiration. Palladio's influence spread across Europe, defining architectural taste for generations. Music flourished. By the early 17th century, Venice was the opera capital of Europe. The first public opera house opened in 1637, making theatrical music accessible to anyone who could afford a ticket, rather than restricting it to aristocratic courts. Monteverdi composed in Venice, creating early operas that remain performed today. Later came Vivaldi, whose concertos captured the energy and movement of Venetian life, quick and bright, and endlessly inventive. Yet beneath the cultural flowering was a melancholic awareness that this golden age was also a sunset. Venice was becoming what declining empires often become, a place where the past is more glorious than the future, where beauty is consolation for lost power, where art flourishes because ambition in other spheres has been frustrated. The city was turning inward, cultivating its own distinctiveness, creating a Venice of the imagination that would outlast the political reality. The consequence of Constantinople's fall was not immediate collapse, but gradual transformation. Venice adapted, survived, and created new forms of wealth and prestige. But the trajectory had shifted. The republic that had once shaped Mediterranean history was now being shaped by forces it could no longer control. The age of Venetian dominance was ending. The age of Venetian beauty was beginning. It was a trade no Venetian merchant would have chosen voluntarily, but like so many trades in Venetian history, once the terms were set, there was nothing to do but accept them and try to profit from the exchange. The world had moved on. Venice would have to find its place in what remained. Walk into any modern bank, and you are walking through a Venetian invention. The clean marble counters, the numbered accounts, the written contracts, the complex financial instruments that move billions across borders in seconds. All of these have roots in medieval Venice. Not the technology, obviously, but the canned concepts. The understanding that money itself could be a commodity, that debt could be bought and sold, that risk could be calculated and shared, that capital could be deployed strategically to generate returns far from its point of origin. Venice did not invent banking. That honour belongs to earlier Italian cities, but Venice perfected it and globalized it. By the 13th century, Venetian merchants operated on credit across the Mediterranean. A trader in Venice could write a letter of credit that would be honoured in Alexandria or Constantinople or London. The promise of future payment, backed by Venetian reputation, was as good as gold. Better than gold, actually, because it was lighter, safer to transport, and easier to divide. This system required trust, and trust required institutions. Venetian banks maintained detailed records, documenting every transaction, every debt, every obligation. When disputes arose, contracts were enforced through Venetian courts, according to established commercial law. The system was not always fair, it favoured insiders with connections, but it was consistent and predictable. Merchants knew the rules, they could plan accordingly. The impact spread across Europe. German merchants adopted Venetian accounting methods. English traders copied Venetian contracts. Spanish colonies used Venetian financial instruments to fund expeditions to the New World. The language of international commerce became, in many ways, Venetian. Words like bank itself, from the Italian banco meaning bench where moneylenders sat, entered languages across Europe. Quarantine, from the Venetian practice of isolating ships for 40 days to prevent plague, became universal. Arsenal, gazette, ghetto, all Venetian words that described Venetian innovations. But Venice's impact extended beyond vocabulary and financial technique. The Republic pioneered a form of government that influenced political thought for centuries. This was not democracy, as modern people understand it. Venetian government was oligarchic, controlled by a few dozen families, but it was also not monarchy or tyranny. Power was distributed, limited, checked by competing institutions. The Doge was elected, not hereditary. Laws were written, not arbitrary. Citizens had rights, even if those rights were restricted to a privileged class. Renaissance political philosophers studied Venice carefully. Machiavelli analysed Venetian institutions in his writings on republics. Later thinkers, including the American founders, examined Venice as a model of mixed government, combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy in a stable system. They rejected much of what they found. Venice was too oligarchic, too conservative, too willing to sacrifice freedom for stability. But the questions Venice raised about how to organise power remained central to Enlightenment political thought. Venice also shaped how Europeans understood diplomacy. The modern system of permanent ambassadors stationed in foreign capitals was essentially a Venetian invention. Before Venice, diplomatic missions were temporary, assembled for specific negotiations, then disbanded. Venice maintained continuous representation in major courts. Ambassadors who lived abroad for years, learned local languages and customs, cultivated relationships, and sent regular reports back to the Senate. These ambassadors were more than messengers. They were intelligence agents, gathering information about political rivalries, military capabilities, economic conditions, anything that might affect Venetian interests. Their dispatches, thousands of which survive in Venetian archives, are among the best historical sources for understanding Renaissance Europe. Venetian ambassadors saw everything, recorded everything, and analysed everything with the cold eye of merchants calculating risk. The reports were systematic. Ambassadors followed templates that required specific information about the countries they served in: population, revenues, military strength, political factions, all documented with as much accuracy as possible. Venice pioneered what we now call intelligence analysis, the transformation of scattered observations into actionable strategic knowledge. Other powers imitated the system. Soon, every major European state maintained permanent embassies following the Venetian model. Diplomacy became professionalized. International relations operated through established channels rather than personal relationships between rulers. The modern diplomatic corps, with its protocols and immunities and conventions, descends directly from Venetian practice. Venice influenced culture as profoundly as politics and commerce. The city became a centre of printing in the 15th and 16th centuries. Aldus Manutius, operating in Venice, pioneered the pocket-sized book, creating portable editions of classical texts that made literature accessible beyond monastery libraries and aristocratic collections. He standardized italic type, developed punctuation systems still used today, and produced books in Greek, Latin, and vernacular Italian that spread Renaissance learning across Europe. Venetian printers enjoyed relatively light censorship compared to other Italian cities. The Inquisition operated in Venice, but was notably less aggressive than in Rome or Spain. Books that would be banned elsewhere found publishers in Venice. This made the city a magnet for controversial ideas, for texts that challenged orthodoxy, for knowledge that other authorities preferred suppressed. Galileo, published in Venice. Protestant texts were printed in Venice and smuggled north. Arabic scientific works were translated in Venice and distributed across Europe. The impact on art was equally profound. Venetian painting emphasized color over line, emotion over intellect, sensuality over austerity. This approach, developed by Giorgione, Titian, and their successors, influenced European art for centuries. The Venetian technique of building up layers of translucent colour created effects impossible with other methods. Paintings seemed to glow from within. Flesh looked warm and alive. Fabrics appeared to have weight and texture. Caravaggio studied Venetian painting. So did Rubens. So did Velázquez. The techniques passed down through generations of artists, shaping how Europeans understood visual representation. Even tourism, that modern industry that now defines Venice for most visitors, was partly a Venetian creation. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Venice had become a destination for wealthy Europeans on the Grand Tour, the educational journey that completed a gentleman's education. They came to see the architecture, the paintings, the carnival, the courtesans, the opera. Venice cultivated this reputation deliberately, marketing itself as a place of beauty and pleasure, compensating for lost political power with cultural prestige. The young travellers who visited Venice carried memories home. They commissioned paintings of Venetian scenes. They imitated Venetian architecture in their country estates. They told stories about Venetian decadence and sophistication. Venice entered the European imagination not as a place, but as an idea, a symbol of refined civilization, of art and commerce perfectly balanced, of beauty created by wealth and wealth created by beauty. That idea persists. Modern Venice, crowded with tourists and struggling with preservation challenges, still benefits from reputation accumulated over centuries. The impact is not just historical but ongoing. Venice shaped the world, and the world is still Venetian. History remembers the dogies, the merchants, the admirals who commanded fleets and negotiated treaties. But Venice was built by people whose names are lost, whose lives left no monuments, whose contributions vanished into the anonymous mass of labour that sustained the Republic for 1,000 years. Consider the Arsenalotti, the workers of the arsenal. 15,000 men at the facility's peak, sawing timber and hammering nails and caulking seams in a deafening environment of constant construction. They worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, their hands rough with splinters and scars, their lungs filled with sawdust and tar fumes. They were better paid than most medieval labourers, receiving steady wages and pensions, but the work destroyed bodies. Men went deaf from the hammering. They developed lung diseases from breathing toxic materials. They lost fingers to saws and limbs to falling timber. Yet they took pride in their craft. An Arsenalotto who worked on a galley that won a major battle would celebrate as enthusiastically as the admiral who commanded it. They wore their distinctive red caps with dignity, marking themselves as the industrial elite of Venice, the men whose skills built the fleets that protected the Republic. When they walked through Venice's streets, other workers showed deference. An Arsenalotto had status, security, and identity in a world where most labourers had none of these things. Or consider the gondoliers, who ferried passengers through Venice's canals for centuries. Rowing a gondola requires enormous skill, manoeuvring the long asymmetric boat through narrow channels, under low bridges, past constant traffic, all while standing and using a single oar. The gondoliers developed their own culture, their own songs, their own fierce independence. They were self-employed contractors, not servants, and they defended that status aggressively. Attempts to regulate them or restrict their numbers met with strikes and riots. The gondoliers knew they were essential. Without them, Venice stopped moving. They saw everything. Gondoliers ferried nobles to secret meetings, merchants to clandestine negotiations, lovers to hidden rendezvous. They heard confessions, complaints, conspiracies whispered in the assumption that servants did not matter, that their presence was invisible. But gondoliers had excellent memories and active social networks. Information spread through the gondolier community faster than through official channels. They were the city's informal intelligence network, aware of everything, trusted with nothing, and occasionally dangerous if offended. Then there were the women, largely absent from official histories, but essential to Venetian society. Merchant wives managed household finances, supervised servants, raised children, and often ran businesses when their husbands travelled for months or years on commercial voyages. They could not hold public office or vote in elections, but they controlled substantial wealth and wielded influence through family connections and social networks. Some women achieved remarkable independence. Courtesans, the elite prostitutes who entertained wealthy clients, operated at the margins of respectable society, but commanded attention and resources that few married women could match. The most successful courtesans were educated, multilingual, skilled in music and poetry. They hosted salons where intellectuals gathered. They commissioned paintings and patronized artists. They lived in luxurious apartments and wore clothes that violated sumptuary laws with impunity because they were too valuable, too connected, too useful to powerful men to be suppressed. Veronica Franco, perhaps the most famous Venetian courtesan, published poetry, corresponded with nobles, and defended herself eloquently when tried by the Inquisition for witchcraft, charges likely motivated by rivals jealous of her success. She represented a peculiarly Venetian phenomenon, women who existed outside conventional social categories, who created space for themselves in a patriarchal society through intelligence, charm, and business acumen. Venice was not progressive by modern standards, but it was pragmatic. If a woman contributed to the city's wealth or prestige, her gender mattered less than her results. Below the courtesans were ordinary prostitutes, thousands of them working in Venice's brothels and streets. They serviced sailors, foreign merchants, and Venetian men seeking anonymous encounters. The government regulated prostitution, licensing brothels, taxing services, and attempting to confine the trade to specific neighborhoods. The regulation failed constantly, but the attempt revealed something important about Venetian governance. The Republic did not try to eliminate prostitution, an impossible task, but rather to manage it, to extract revenue from it, to keep it from disrupting commerce and public order. The city's Jewish population lived under similarly pragmatic oppression. Jews had resided in Venice since the Middle Ages, working as moneylenders, physicians, and merchants. In 1516, the government forced the Jewish community into a confined area, the world's first ghetto, from the Venetian word ghetto meaning foundry for the site's previous use. High, the walls surrounded the ghetto, gates locked at night. Jews were required to wear identifying badges. The restrictions were humiliating and often dangerous. Yet within the ghetto, Jewish cultural life flourished. Synagogues were built, some architecturally magnificent, despite external plainness required by law. Hebrew printing presses operated, producing religious texts and philosophical works. Jewish physicians maintained practices that served Christian patients. Moneylenders provided capital that Venetian merchants depended on, since Christian religious law restricted usury. Venice oppressed its Jews, but it also needed them. The result was a tense accommodation, neither freedom nor complete subjection, but something characteristically Venetian in its mixture of exploitation and tolerance. The lagoon fishermen formed another forgotten class. They rose before dawn to check nets and traps, selling their catch in the Rialto markets before most of the city awoke. They were poor by Venetian standards, living in simple houses on the lagoon's edge, but they possessed knowledge that money could not buy. They understood the tides, the channels, the seasonal migrations of fish and birds. They could navigate the lagoon in fog so thick that landmarks disappeared. They were the descendants of the original refugees who founded Venice, and they maintained traditions older than the Republic itself. Servants, porters, bakers, blacksmiths, rope makers, weavers, the list of necessary but forgotten people extends almost indefinitely. Each occupation had its own guild, its own regulations, its own traditions. Each contributed to the vast collective effort that was Venice. The doges made decisions, but these people implemented them. The merchants traded, but these people produced. The nobles governed, but these people obeyed, and occasionally resisted. Their voices are mostly silent in historical records, but their labour echoes in every stone of Venice, in every ship that sailed from the Bly. Arsenal, in every fortune accumulated by patrician families. Venice was not built by heroes alone. It was built by ordinary people doing extraordinary work, generation after generation, their individual lives forgotten, but their collective achievement immortal. The city remembers them, even if history does not. Not everyone loved Venice. Not everyone submitted peacefully to Venetian dominance. For every merchant who prospered under the Republic's protection, there was a competitor crushed by Venetian monopolies. For every city that allied with Venice, there was another that fought desperately against Venetian expansion. For every noble family that governed from the Doge's palace, there were exiles plotting revenge from foreign courts. Venice made enemies efficiently. The most persistent opposition came from Genoa, Venice's ancient rival for control of Mediterranean commerce. The two republics fought 4 major wars between 1257 and 1381. Each conflict more destructive than the last. The wars were not about territory or religion, but about trade routes and market dominance. Genoa controlled the western Mediterranean and the trade routes to Spain and North Africa. Venice controlled the eastern Mediterranean and the routes to Constantinople and the Black Sea. Neither could tolerate the other's success. The War of Chioggia, the fourth and final conflict, nearly destroyed Venice. In 1379, Genoese forces captured Chioggia, a fortified town at the southern entrance to the Venetian lagoon. For the first time in its history, Venice itself faced imminent invasion. The Genoese fleet controlled the southern lagoon. Supply lines were cut. Panic spread through the city. Some nobles proposed surrender. Others advocated evacuating to Venetian colonies and rebuilding elsewhere. Venice chose resistance. The Senate emptied the treasury to build more ships. Churches donated gold and silver to be melted down for military expenses. Citizens volunteered for galley crews. The arsenal worked day and night, producing vessels faster than the Genoese could sink them. Slowly, methodically, Venice blockaded Chioggia, trapping the Genoese garrison. 6 months later, the Genoese surrendered. Venice had survived, but barely. Genoa never recovered from the defeat. The war bankrupted the Republic and triggered political chaos that left it vulnerable to foreign domination. Within decades, Genoa had become a French puppet, then a Spanish possession, its independence lost. Venice had won, but the victory demonstrated how close the Republic had come to destruction. The trauma shaped Venetian strategy for generations. Never again would Venice allow an enemy fleet into the lagoon. The opposition was not only external. Within Venice itself, dissent simmered beneath the surface of Republican harmony. The Tiepolo conspiracy of 1310 nearly overthrew the government. Baiamonte Tiepolo, a noble from one of Venice's oldest families, gathered supporters angry about political exclusion and economic grievances. They planned to seize the Doge's palace during a ceremony when the Doge would be vulnerable. The plot was betrayed at the last moment. Tiepolo's forces attacked anyway, fighting in the streets around San Marco before being defeated by loyal troops. Tiepolo fled to exile. His co-conspirators were executed. Their houses were demolished. The conspiracy shocked Venice. It revealed that even within the patrician class, unity was fragile. The response was the creation of the Council of Ten, the secret police force that would dominate Venetian politics for centuries. The council was initially temporary, established to root out remaining conspirators, but it became permanent, growing in power until it rivaled the Senate itself. Opposition to the government became suicidal. The Ten had informants everywhere, unlimited powers of arrest and interrogation, and no requirement to justify their actions publicly. Yet dissent persisted. In 1582, the Inquisition arrested and tortured a young nobleman named Giordano Bruno for heretical views about cosmology and religion. Bruno was not Venetian by birth. He was born in Naples, but he had sought refuge in Venice, believing the Republic's relative tolerance would protect him. He was wrong. Under pressure from Rome, Venice surrendered Bruno to the Papal Inquisition. He was burned at the stake in Rome 8 years later. The betrayal stained Venice's reputation among intellectuals across Europe. Common people resisted in less dramatic, but equally persistent ways. Smuggling was endemic, a permanent shadow economy that evaded Venetian taxes and monopolies. Fishermen smuggled goods from the mainland into the city. Sailors smuggled goods from foreign ports. Even arsenal workers smuggled naval stores and materials out of the facility, selling them on black markets. The government prosecuted smugglers constantly, but the practice never stopped. For every smuggler caught, 10 others continued operating. Labour unrest erupted periodically. Arsenal workers struck for higher wages in the 15th century, refusing to work until the Senate negotiated. Gondoliers rioted when regulations threatened their independence. Bakers protested grain price controls. Venice was not a democracy, but neither was it a tyranny, capable of simply crushing dissent through force. The government had to negotiate, to compromise, to acknowledge grievances even when it could not fully address them. The opposition also came from the church. Venice's relationship with the papacy was perpetually tense. Popes claimed spiritual authority over all Christendom, including Venice. Venice claimed independence in temporal matters, including control over church property within the Republic. The conflict erupted dramatically in 1606, when Pope Paul V placed Venice under interdict, essentially excommunicating the entire city, forbidding priests from administering sacraments, and ordering Catholics across Europe to sever relations with the Republic. Venice responded with defiance. The Senate refused to acknowledge the interdict. Venetian priests were ordered to continue performing services. Any priest who obeyed the Pope rather than the Republic was exiled. Venice justified its position through sophisticated theological and legal arguments produced by Paolo Sarpi, a brilliant scholar who argued that the Church had no authority over temporal political matters. The standoff lasted a year, before being resolved through French mediation. Venice made minimal concessions. The Pope lifted the interdict. Both sides claimed victory. But the crisis revealed the limits of papal power and the strength of Venetian independence. Venice had faced down the Pope himself and survived. No other Catholic state in Europe could make that claim. The victory enhanced Venice's reputation among Protestants and freethinkers who saw the Republic as a defender of liberty against papal tyranny. Yet all this opposition, external and internal, violent and intellectual, ultimately failed to destroy Venice. The Republic was too flexible, too rich, too willing to compromise when necessary, and too ruthless when compromise failed. It absorbed dissent, or crushed it, depending on circumstances. It negotiated with enemies, or defeated them. It bent before storms, and straightened when they passed. The opposition revealed Venice's vulnerabilities, but also its resilience. A system that could survive Genoa, internal conspiracies, church interdicts, and constant popular resistance was a system built to endure. Not forever, nothing endures forever, but longer than its enemies expected. Longer than seemed possible. Resistance made Venice stronger, forcing adaptation, compelling innovation, and requiring constant vigilance. The opposition failed, but Venice remembered the lesson. Eternal vigilance was the price of survival. While Venice's political power declined, through the 16th and 17th centuries, something unexpected happened. The city bloomed. Not economically, profits from trade continued falling as Atlantic powers captured New World wealth. Not militarily, Ottoman pressure forced Venice into a defensive posture, losing colonies one by one. But culturally, intellectually, artistically, Venice experienced a renaissance that transformed it from a commercial empire into something more enduring, a civilization. The transformation was gradual and initially unintentional. Wealthy merchant families, facing declining opportunities for commercial investment, diverted capital into art and architecture. If they could no longer expand trade networks, they could at least beautify the city. Palaces were renovated with increasing splendor. Churches were decorated with commissioned paintings. Public spaces were enhanced with sculpture and architectural ornament. Venice became a showcase of Renaissance aesthetics, every square foot designed to impress. The painters came first, or rather, they rose to prominence in ways that previous generations had not. Titian dominated the 16th century, living to nearly 90 and producing masterpieces throughout his long career. His work combined technical virtuosity with emotional depth. Religious paintings conveyed genuine spirituality rather than mere piety. Portraits captured psychological complexity, suggesting inner lives behind aristocratic faces. His use of colour was revolutionary, building up layers of glaze to create effects previous painters had not imagined possible. Titian's success attracted students and imitators. Tintoretto developed a more dramatic style, filling enormous canvases with dynamic compositions, where figures seemed to move through space. His work in the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, over 50 paintings created over 23 years, remains one of the most ambitious decorative programs in European art. The paintings cover walls and ceilings, surrounding viewers with biblical narratives rendered in Tintoretto's characteristic turbulent energy. Veronese offered yet another approach, celebrating the material world with a sensuality that sometimes alarmed religious authorities. His painting of the Last Supper included dogs, dwarfs, German soldiers, and other details that the Inquisition considered inappropriate for sacred subjects. When summoned to explain himself, Veronese calmly argued that artists needed creative freedom to make their work engaging. The painting was renamed Feast in the House of Levi and allowed to remain on display. Veronese had defended artistic liberty and won. These painters and others transformed Venice into an art centre, rivaling Florence and Rome. Foreign patrons commissioned Venetian paintings. Young artists travelled to Venice to study colour technique and compositional innovation. Venetian art became an export commodity, as valuable as any traditional trade good. Paintings could not be intercepted by pirates or taxed by customs officials. They generated prestige that military victories no longer provided. Architecture underwent similar transformation. Andrea Palladio, though not born in Venice, found his greatest patron in the Republic. His churches and buildings combined classical proportion with innovative spatial design. San Giorgio Maggiore, visible across the lagoon from the Piazza San Marco, demonstrates Palladian principles perfectly. The facade references Roman temple architecture, but the interior is pure Christian basilica, flooded with light from high windows, spacious and serene. The building is simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and revolutionary. Palladio's influence extended far beyond Venice. His treatise on architecture, illustrated with precise drawings and detailed explanations, became the most influential architectural text of the early modern period. Buildings across Europe and eventually America were designed according to Palladian principles. Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is essentially a Palladian villa transplanted to Virginia. The style originated in Venetian commissions and spread worldwide, carrying Venetian aesthetics long after Venetian political power had faded. Music completed the transformation. Venice had always appreciated music. Religious services featured elaborate choral works, but in the 17th century musical innovation accelerated. Giovanni Gabrieli composed for the unusual acoustics of San Marco Basilica, placing choirs in different locations to create antiphonal effects, voices answering each other across space. The music was architectural, designed for specific buildings, exploiting their particular resonances. Then came opera. The first public opera house opened in Venice in 1637, the Teatro San Cassiano. Previous operas had been private entertainments for aristocratic courts. Venice commercialized the art form, making it accessible to anyone who could afford admission. The innovation was typically Venetian, identifying a market opportunity and exploiting it efficiently. Within decades, Venice had multiple opera houses competing for audiences. Composers produced new works constantly, some successful, most forgotten, but all contributing to a vibrant musical culture. Claudio Monteverdi spent his final years in Venice, composing operas that established many conventions of the genre. His L'Incoronazione di Poppea, premiered in Venice in 1643, portrayed historical figures as flawed human beings rather than mythological archetypes. The music conveyed psychological complexity, characters changed and developed through the narrative. Opera was discovering its potential as drama, not just as musical spectacle. By the early 18th century, Venice was synonymous with opera. Antonio Vivaldi, employed by a girls' orphanage to teach music, composed concertos and operas at astonishing speed. His Four Seasons, 4 violin concertos depicting seasonal changes, became some of the most recognized classical music ever written. The pieces were programmatic, each movement accompanied by sonnets describing the scenes being musically portrayed. Spring was joyful and energetic. Winter was harsh and introspective. The music captured mood and atmosphere with unprecedented vividness. All this creativity was funded by declining wealth. Venice was no longer the richest city in Europe, but it remained rich enough to support artists. More importantly, it provided an environment where art mattered, where cultural achievement brought status, where beauty was valued for its own sake, rather than merely as propaganda or religious instruction. Venice developed a genuine aesthetic culture, people who attended operas not because they were fashionable, but because they loved music, who commissioned paintings because they appreciated art, who built according to Palladian principles because they understood classical proportion. The awakening was Venice recognizing that power takes many forms. Military strength fades, commercial dominance shifts, but culture endures. A beautiful painting outlasts a conquered territory. A brilliant opera survives long after the fleet that once protected trade routes has rotted to splinters. Architecture remains when the government that commissioned it has disappeared. Venice, perhaps unconsciously, was building its legacy, creating something that would outlast the Republic itself, transforming from an empire to an idea, from a political reality to a cultural memory. The awakening was realizing that survival comes in multiple forms. Venice, the city-state, would eventually die. But Venice, the civilization, Venice, the aesthetic achievement, Venice, the dream built on water and sustained by beauty that could be eternal. The stones would remember, the paintings would endure, the music would echo across centuries. Venice was becoming immortal. The end came not with war or plague or economic collapse, but with a signature on a treaty. On May 12, 1797, Ludovico Manin, the last Doge of Venice, surrendered the Republic to Napoleon Bonaparte without a single shot being fired in the city's defense. 11 centuries of independence ended in a meeting room, concluded with diplomatic language, finalized with ink and wax seals. The Venetian Empire, which had survived the Black Death and the fall of Constantinople and wars with the Ottomans, capitulated to a French general barely 27 years old. The betrayal was not that Venice fell. All empires fall eventually. The betrayal was how Venice fell, without resistance, without even attempting to fight. The arsenal still stood, capable of producing ships. The treasury still held substantial wealth. The population was loyal. Yet the government simply gave up, surrendered, dissolved the republic as casually as merchants liquidating an unprofitable business. What happened? How did a republic that had prided itself on survival, that had defined itself through resistance to external pressure, simply cease to exist? The revelation is uncomfortable. Venice did not fall because it was defeated. It fell because the patrician class that governed it no longer believed in what Venice represented. They had become exactly what Venice had always feared: aristocrats more concerned with preserving personal wealth than collective survival. The system designed to prevent tyranny had instead created stagnation. The republic meant to last forever had ossified into irrelevance. The rot had been visible for decades to anyone willing to look. The Great Council, which technically included all patrician males and once numbered over 1,000 members, had shrunk to fewer than 200 families by the 18th century. Some families died out. Others were bankrupted by declining trade and expensive lifestyles. The survivors were increasingly intermarried, a closed caste suspicious of outsiders and innovation. New ideas were rejected. Reforms were blocked. Venice governed itself through precedent and tradition, unable to adapt to a world that had moved beyond Mediterranean commerce. The economy had contracted severely. Venice still produced luxury goods, fine glass, elegant textiles, but these items competed with products from France, England, and the Netherlands. Venetian manufacturing was not more efficient or cheaper. It survived on reputation alone, and reputation was insufficient in an age of industrial production. The Arsenal, once the most advanced factory in Europe, had become a museum, still capable of building wooden galleys in an era when naval warfare required iron hulls and steam engines. The government was broke. Centuries of wars against the Ottomans had drained the treasury. The loss of colonies meant loss of revenue. Venice borrowed extensively, selling government bonds to citizens and foreign investors. By the 1790s, debt service consumed most of the budget. There was no money for military modernization or even basic maintenance. The fleet rotted in harbour. Fortifications crumbled. Venice could not defend itself, even if it wanted to. But the deeper problem was psychological. The patricians governing Venice no longer identified primarily as Venetians. They were cosmopolitan aristocrats who spoke French, admired Parisian fashion, and held Enlightenment ideals about universal human rights. The idea of dying for Venice, of sacrificing personal comfort for collective survival, seemed antiquated. They were not cowards exactly, but they were no longer willing to pay the price that previous generations had paid to maintain independence. When Napoleon's armies approached in 1797, sweeping across northern Italy and defeating Austrian forces, Venice faced a choice: resist and face destruction, or surrender and hope for generous terms. The debate in the Great Council lasted hours. Some nobles advocated resistance. Most argued for negotiation. In the end, Venice chose survival over honour. The terms were brutal. Venice would be dissolved as an independent state. The territory would be divided between France and Austria. The patrician class would retain their property but lose all political power. The thousand-year republic would become a memory. Manin, the last doge, reportedly wept as he removed his ceremonial cap and laid it aside, saying he would not need it again. His tears were genuine, but they were also insufficient. He had presided over the extinction of the state he was elected to lead. History would remember him as the man who lost Venice. The revelation is not that Venice fell, but what its fall revealed about the nature of political systems. Venice was not destroyed by external enemies. It was destroyed by internal decay, by the gradual erosion of civic virtue, by the transformation of public-spirited merchants into self-interested aristocrats. The institutions that had made Venice strong, the councils and committees that distributed power and prevented tyranny, had become mechanisms for blocking change. The flexibility that had enabled medieval Venice to adapt to new circumstances had hardened into rigid tradition. Venice fell because it stopped believing in itself. The patricians who governed in 1797 no longer thought Venice could compete with France or Austria or any major European power. They were probably right, but their pessimism became self-fulfilling. A state that does not believe in its own survival will not fight for it. Venice surrendered because its leaders had already surrendered psychologically, accepting decline as inevitable, accommodating themselves to a future where Venice was provincial and powerless. This is the deepest truth. Empires do not fall because they are conquered. They fall because they accept conquest. Venice had survived centuries of apparently stronger enemies through determination, cunning, and the collective will to endure. When that will evaporated, when the patrician class decided that personal comfort mattered more than Venetian independence, the end came quickly and peacefully. Napoleon stayed in Venice only briefly before trading it to Austria in exchange for other territories. The Austrians governed Venice as a provincial backwater for decades. In 1848, Venetians briefly revolted and declared a restored republic, but the revolution failed. Austrian troops besieged the city and starved it into submission. Venice had one last chance to prove its willingness to fight and die for independence. Some did, but most did not. By the time Italy was unified in 1866 and Venice became part of the new Italian kingdom, almost no one remembered what Venetian independence had meant. The great families were impoverished or extinct. The arsenal was silent. The palaces were decaying. Venice had become what it remains today, a museum city, beautiful and melancholic, haunted by its own past. Revelation is simple and terrible. Nothing lasts forever. Not wealth, not power, not even the will to survive. Venice was not destroyed. It dissolved, quietly and without drama, into history. What does Venice teach us across the centuries? Not the Venice of tourist brochures and gondola rides, but the real Venice, the desperate refuge that became an empire, the merchant republic that conquered kingdoms, the civilization built on salt and ambition, and wooden stakes driven into mud. What truths about human nature and political organization survive the collapse of the republic itself? The first lesson is about adaptation. Venice existed because it learned to thrive in an environment that should have been uninhabitable. The lagoon was not chosen for its advantages, but accepted as the only available option. Yet from that constrained beginning, Venice created systems and skills that became its greatest strengths. The inability to farm forced development of maritime trade. The lack of natural defences required naval power. The absence of feudal land ownership enabled commercial meritocracy. This suggests something profound about human capability. We are most creative when most constrained, most innovative when traditional paths are blocked. Venice did not succeed despite the lagoon's challenges, but because of them. The difficulties forced solutions that turned disadvantages into competitive advantages. Modern organizations face the same dynamic. The companies and societies that thrive are often those that have learned to exploit their constraints creatively rather than lamenting their limitations. The second lesson is about institutions. Venice lasted 11 centuries because it built systems that transcended individuals. The Doge was important but replaceable. Merchant families rose and fell, yet the Republic endured because power was distributed, decisions were collective, and no single person or faction could destroy the system through incompetence or ambition. This was not democracy, but it was not tyranny either. It was something carefully balanced between extremes. Yet the same institutions that provided stability eventually produced stagnation. By the 18th century, the councils and committees designed to prevent tyranny were preventing everything, including necessary reform. The system had become its own enemy. This is the paradox of successful institutions. They must be strong enough to endure crisis, but flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. Venice solved the first problem, but ultimately failed the second. The institutions outlasted their usefulness, preserved by people who confused tradition with wisdom. The third lesson concerns commerce and warfare. Venice proved that merchants could be warriors, that the skills required for successful trade, risk assessment, logistics management, strategic thinking, were the same skills required for military success. This contradicted medieval assumptions about separate warrior and commercial classes. Venice showed that effectiveness mattered more than breeding, that results trumped tradition, that an army of motivated businessmen could defeat knights and nobles who treated war as an aristocratic sport. But Venice also demonstrated the limits of commercial warfare. When fighting was about trade routes and market access, Venice excelled. When conflicts became ideological or national, when enemies fought for religious or political reasons beyond economic calculation, Venice struggled. The Republic could not inspire the passionate loyalty that monarchies and ideologies generated. Venetians fought intelligently and bravely, but they did not die gladly for abstract principles. This was pragmatic, but ultimately limiting. Modern states face similar tensions between practical interests and inspiring ideals. The fourth lesson is about cultural legacy. Venice's political power lasted 11 centuries. Its cultural influence is still growing. The paintings, architecture, music, and literature produced during Venice's decline prove more durable than territorial conquests or commercial monopolies. Beauty outlasts power. Ideas survive institutions. This is not argument against political or economic achievement, but recognition that civilizations are remembered for their contributions to human culture more than their military victories or trade balances. Venice suggests that decline can be productive, that sunset periods sometimes generate the most lasting achievements. When imperial expansion was no longer possible, Venice turned inward and created art. When commercial dominance faded, Venice produced music and architecture. The greatest cultural flowering occurred during political and economic contraction. Perhaps there is consolation in this. Perhaps civilizations in decline have their own forms of achievement, different from, but not inferior, to the accomplishments of rising powers. The fifth lesson is about survival requiring belief. Venice endured as long as its citizens believed in Venice, as long as the patrician class was willing to sacrifice personal interests for collective survival. When that belief eroded, when aristocrats valued comfort over independence, the Republic collapsed with startling speed. Institutions are not self-sustaining. They require continuous commitment, constant renewal of purpose, periodic willingness to pay costs for maintaining collective goods. This applies to all political systems. Democracies survive only as long as citizens believe in democratic values and are willing to defend them. Market economies function only when participants trust that contracts will be enforced and property respected. International orders persist only when major powers accept the rules. None of these systems is automatic or inevitable. All require belief, effort, sacrifice. When belief fails, the system fails, regardless of how well designed its institutions might be. The sixth lesson concerns endings. Venice did not end dramatically. There was no final siege, no heroic last stand, no martyrs defending the Piazza San Marco against overwhelming odds. The end came quietly, in a meeting room, with a signature. This is how most civilizations end, not with catastrophe, but with exhaustion, not with external conquest, but with internal acceptance that continuing is too difficult, too expensive, too contrary to immediate self-interest. The revelation is uncomfortable. We prefer to imagine that great civilizations fall only when physically destroyed, that surrender requires overwhelming force. Venice proves otherwise. A civilization can choose to end itself, can simply stop maintaining the beliefs and institutions that sustained it, can dissolve peacefully into history. This should terrify anyone concerned with preserving their own society's achievements. Survival is not guaranteed. Continuity requires commitment. Preservation demands effort. Venice reminds us that nothing is permanent, except impermanence itself. Empires rise and fall, wealth accumulates and dissipates. Power shifts unpredictably, but the stones remain, the paintings endure, the music echoes. The stories get told and retold across centuries. What we create in art and thought outlasts what we achieve in politics and commerce. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Build beautifully, because beauty survives. Create thoughtfully, because ideas persist. Live deliberately, because how we live matters more than how long we last. Venice understood this, eventually. The revelation came too late to save the Republic, but it came in time to save Venice's soul, to ensure that when political power vanished, cultural memory remained. And memory, in the end, is the only immortality any civilization can achieve. Stand at dawn in the Piazza San Marco, before the tourists arrive, before the city wakes fully, and listen. The stones remember. They remember the refugees who waded into the lagoon, fleeing barbarian armies, who drove wooden stakes into mud and built shelters on unstable islands. They remember the salt merchants loading flat-bottomed boats, the first ventures that would become an empire. They remember the ships built in the arsenal, thousands of them across centuries, launching from these shores to dominate the Mediterranean. The basilica remembers every stolen column, every plundered mosaic, every bronze horse and marble capital speaks of conquest and ambition. The building is a chronicle written in stone and gold, recording Venice's rise from refuge to republic to empire. It remembers when it was new, when the gold leaf was fresh, when crowds gathered to celebrate the stolen bones of St. Mark. It remembers centuries of doges inaugurated beneath its domes. It remembers when prayer was politics and faith was power. The palaces along the Grand Canal remember. Their facades, weathered by salt air and time, once gleamed with fresh paint in ochre and vermilion. Behind those walls, merchant, princes calculated risks and profits. Diplomatic negotiations decided the fate of kingdoms. Family alliances were forged through marriage contracts, drafted with the same precision used for spice shipments. The palaces remember when Venice mattered, when being Venetian meant something, when these buildings housed power rather than memories. The canals remember. They carried everything: trade goods and sewage, wedding barges and funeral processions, secret lovers meeting at night, and conspirators fleeing dawn arrests. The water remembers gondoliers singing as they rode, their voices echoing off stone walls. It remembers the splash of bodies dumped by the Council of Ten, political enemies disposed of quietly, disappeared without trial or grave marker. The canals keep secrets better than stone. But memory is not enough. Venice is not a museum, not yet entirely, though it approaches that fate with each passing year. The city still lives, still breathes, still changes with the tides. Venetians still wake each morning, still work, still love and argue and die in the same houses their ancestors occupied for centuries. Children still play in campos, where medieval merchants once negotiated deals. Fishermen still check nets in the lagoon using knowledge passed down through generations. Yet modern Venice is haunted by its past in ways that other cities are not. The weight of history is physical here, visible in every crumbling facade, audible in every bell tower, tangible in the stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Venetians cannot escape their inheritance. It surrounds them, defines them, shapes how they understand themselves and their city. The tourists come by millions now, more people visiting in a single year than lived in Venice during its entire history. They flood through the narrow streets, photographing bridges and churches, riding gondolas, buying glass trinkets in shops that sell nothing authentic. They stay for hours or days, see what their guidebooks tell them to see, then depart. They experience Venice as a fantasy, a beautiful backdrop for vacation photos, a place that exists for their entertainment. But Venice is not fantasy. It is real, has always been real, built by real people facing real challenges, sustained by real labour and real sacrifice. The stones remember this, even when the visitors do not. The stones know that every palazzo was paid for with someone's risk. Every church was built with someone's devotion. Every canal was dug by someone's labour. Venice was not created by magic or legend, but by human effort repeated across centuries. The legacy is complicated. Venice pioneered systems of banking and commerce that enabled global capitalism. It developed diplomatic practices that became modern international relations. It created art and architecture that defined aesthetic standards for centuries. Yet it also trafficked in slaves, plundered Christian cities, operated secret police, and maintained rigid social speaking hierarchies. The legacy is not pure, not simple, not easily celebrated without acknowledging what was sacrificed and who was exploited to build this impossible city. Perhaps this complexity is itself the legacy. Venice teaches that human achievement is always ambiguous, that the same society can produce both masterpieces and atrocities, that progress and oppression often advance together. There are no simple stories, no uncomplicated heroes. Venice was ruthlessly pragmatic, willing to do whatever was necessary to survive and prosper. That pragmatism built an empire. It also corroded the civic virtues that made the empire possible. Today, Venice faces new existential threats. Climate change is raising sea levels, flooding increasing in frequency and severity. Mass tourism erodes the city's livability, driving residents away, transforming neighbourhoods into theme parks. The population of historical Venice has fallen below 50,000, down from over 170,000 in the 1950s. At current rates, Venice will become a museum city within decades, inhabited only by hotel workers and shopkeepers, serving an endless stream of day trippers. The stones will remember this too. Another chapter in Venice's long history of adaptation and survival, another challenge that requires innovation and sacrifice. Whether Venice can survive the 21st century as a living city, rather than a tourist attraction, remains uncertain. The outcome will be determined not by fate or fortune, but by choices made by Venetians and the global community that claims to cherish this improbable place. But regardless of what comes, the legacy is secure. Venice proved that human beings can build beauty in the most unlikely places, can create civilizations from nothing, can endure for centuries through intelligence and will. The Republic is dead, has been dead for over 2 centuries. But Venice survives. The stones remain, the canals still flow, the light still reflects off water in that peculiar golden shimmer found nowhere else on earth. And in the quiet moments before dawn, before the crowds arrive, when the city belongs again to itself, you can still hear it. The whisper of wooden stakes being driven into mud, the splash of oars in dark canals, the voices of merchants bargaining in a dozen languages, the prayers of refugees asking saints for protection, the hammers of the arsenal building ships that will never sail again. Venice remembers. Venice endures. Venice remains. The dream built on water continues, fragile and impossible, and heartbreakingly beautiful, forever balanced between stone and tide.